Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming such an early morning compared with the Art Basel season, and it's also not easy to find this place at the end of the whole corridor. However, yeah, it's a great opportunity for today. We are talking about how to build a historical defining collection of contemporary Chinese art. This partially is also in the background of the newly opened M Plus with huge collection and Chinese art collection of M Plus Sigg collection. And this also be triggered with a kind of when we talk about this conversation, it's also my about one of my interview last year. We talking about like how important the collection should be when we, in the meantime, think about the market, think about all these kind of the museum buildings. Because like if we don't have a historical, authoritative, or canonical collection, sometimes it will also be challenging for the collectors to navigate in the whole field of the marketing or this kind of the collecting. So that's where we're talking about. So we have two persons here. That's my job, and Johnson and Uli. And further to that introduction, I want to also talk about what's the rationale here, why we have these two persons here. I think Johnson was first in Beijing in the later 1970s, and right, that's the time where he was the witness of the Star Group, which at that time they just showed their work on the street, and some work he saw later became part of the Sigg collection, which is now last year was on display at M Plus. And Johnson came back to Hong Kong, and in the 1990s, in the 1989, he did like a 10 years anniversary show for the Star Group. And later on that, in the early 1990s, he created a very important historical show called Chinese New Art after 1989, and then in 5 years' time, this show toured to the major institutions in Europe at that time, and this show really contributed the narrative about the Chinese contemporary art. That's why we have the Johnson here, and the Uli here. Like since the 80s, he was a businessman in China, and then from that time, step by step, he as a businessman, as the ambassador, as the collector, step by step in like more than 10 years' time, he built up in enormous comprehensive collection of Chinese art. And in the middle of the first decade of the 2000, in the 2005, and then he started to tour his collection show in Europe and in the American under the subject of the mahjong. And besides of the mahjong show, he also have some small subject like a shanshui, landscape, like this kind of calligraphy. So that's a long way he really showing his collection in the different circumstances until 2012, the collection donated to M+. I'm honored to be 11 years as the Sigg senior creator, which like doing the research for the collection, and we realized the two collection shows since 2021 and until the recent one, Another Story. So for me, these two heroes here, they really represent a different period of this kind of the collection. Johnson really from the 80s to 90s, and Uli from the middle of 90s through like till now. Yeah, and so that's how to contextualize the speakers here, and we really want to see the historical defining collection. So begin the conversation, I want to say that we just talked about there are several things quite interesting. The first question is about not always every collector, when they began to collect, they think they will build up the historical collection. People have the different motive of the collection. People may just collect work because it's beautiful. People maybe just collect something because it's like articulate. They want to have something, or for commercial investment reasons. So not every collector has this kind of the motivation to build up the historical defining collection. So my first question to both collectors and also the gallery list, well, what is your motivation of the collecting, and when did you start collecting? Yeah. Johnson, do you want to start? It's a very simple question.
Maybe it's more suitable for Uli to give this question first, no?
Not necessarily.
Well, of course, I always have this urge to own things and collect things, and especially when I see things which I feel precious. And one of the motivation of his urge was the breaking up of Chinese civilization. So my obsession of all my life has been about picking up the shards and trying to do something with them. But as far as art collecting, although of course I have this collector's urge, I mean it's a kind of illness, but perhaps we all have it. But as a real collector, a systematic collector, I really collected things by default because I also have an art gallery. So I collected things I couldn't sell. And so that is part of it. And then, of course, there are things that I didn't want to sell. Today, I continue to do things in this very unsystematic way, except for some projects, as you mentioned just now, some exhibitions, which were made for particular, how we say, memorial to an era. So they were actually done with history in mind. Mm-hmm. But history, perhaps art history, perhaps cultural history.
Okay. Thank you. Uli?
We all start out as what I would call accumulators of things, accumulators of artworks. That doesn't make a collector yet, in my perspective. That's no value judgment. It's perfectly okay not to be a collector, but accumulate things according to our own taste. Since we need to live with it, we need to like it, so we accumulate things according to what we like at the moment, and maybe our taste or what we think is taste may change over time, and we sell and buy different things. So I think that's how everyone starts. For me, a collector, as a term, comes into place when we have a focus, what we do, when we have an intent and a focus to go beyond what I like it, but things that follow like an idea. That means bringing work together that explain each other, that maybe charge each other up, that such type of focus. The focus can be anything, and doesn't have to be art. In fact, can be matches or I don't know what. But when we have some experience, when we enter a space, we can immediately say, is there a soul, focus, something? Or is it just accumulation of things, which is perfectly all right for that people? So you're asking me, when did I become a collector? Actually, later only, when I came to China, end of the 70s. Then I had this naive idea I can talk to contemporary artists. But they didn't exist in the sense of the West. So I had to wait. I looked at the material, like the Star exhibition and so on, but I didn't collect it. I thought, well, that's like 100 years painted too late, etc., etc. So I waited. And then about a decade later, it took me that long, I thought, well, now the Chinese artists have come to their own language. So I thought I'd buy a few things for myself. And while doing this, then I realized no one is collecting the Chinese contemporary art beyond more random approach. And I thought, yeah, someone must build that collection. Maybe a national museum should, but didn't. So then, from then on, I consider me a collector, because I had an idea, a concept, and well, that's enough for the moment. I could explain more, you know, how you go from focus, etc.
So that's quite interesting. Like articulate is very important thing, and still a long distance between the articulate and the collection. The collection was still your lens, your idea. My question also to Johnson, that when you first came into China, it's also the same, like a whole contemporary underground until 1993. You do the post 1989 show. That's one of the first, I would say, comprehensive historical survey show about the Chinese art after the 1979. And as I said, this whole show built up the major, mainstream narrative of Chinese contemporary art in the whole 1990s, from cynical realism, political pop, all this kind of the dimension you create in that show. So maybe it's a good opportunity for today, so you can share about your experience at that time from your culture preserved motivation and why and how you want to build up the projects, and from your experience in the last 10 years in the 20th century, and how this type of the narrative and the collection since been a part of the mainstream of the Chinese art and narratives. Yeah.
These two exhibitions were indeed organized with history in mind, yeah, and of course art history. But to be totally frank, my personal interest is in classical Chinese cultural history, since that could not meet the challenge of the times culturally nor aesthetically. We have this huge transformation, political revolution, cultural revolution, and it went into a direction which needed to be reinterpreted, and the Stars was the first art group that I think we can say avant-garde since the mid-century. In a sense, it was a social political movement and a cultural movement together, like what happened in China in early 20th century. So for that, it is very important, and I wanted to bring it out of China. So the 10-year retrospective show, which is much reduced to only a dozen, 15 artists, was held in Hong Kong. And it also happened at a critical time. Firstly, it happened after the very important the mid-80s new wave, the 85 new wave, which brought us some I think probably the most important modern or rather contemporary artists. And so by the time I was organizing the Stars 10 years, it was actually done with Michael Chang, who was the previous, when the shows happened, Michael Chang was the previous director of the Hong Kong Art Center. So he basically did all the organizational work and communicated with the artists. By that time, I was very much interested in what happened beyond them, including mainly from places like Hangzhou, Beijing, on Southwest, but mainly around what happened with the artists in Hangzhou. So that show opened January of 1989, and then immediately it developed, the political situation developed into June 4th, 89, and then a radical change in the entire Chinese political economic system. It was actually already evolving very rapidly in the 80s, but then it took a radical turn. And so the post-89 show was curated with a very specific agenda, which was to follow on the famous China avant-garde show, and also in January 1989, which I saw, and then I invited Li Shenting to take part in the selection of artists, but my agenda was a little bit different from what Chinese curators were doing at the time, because many of them were interested in promoting different movements over the time, and we still think of many of the artworks or art production as aesthetic and cultural movements. Yeah. So the idea of that particular show, post-89 show, was to actually mainly focus on artists who were already established names in the 85 New Wave, and using their transformation between their work in 89 and 92 to define what was the 1990s. Yeah. So it was about the aesthetic transformation under the new social-political situation at the time. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's also my experience. Well, I was in Beijing from the 1990s, and then I really have the witness as a art community, people see how the exhibition you created really build up this kind of the momentum to promote the Chinese art internationally. But at that time, the all focus is quite on what happened in 1990s, like a cynical realism, political pop, and then later on the gaudy art, 艳俗艺术. That's whole wave, like a wave and a wave in China. And at that time, we don't really look what happened in the 80s. When I joined the M+, when I dealing with the Sigg collection, I surprisingly found like he already collect quite a comprehensive part for 80s. And then my first 5 years job in M+, we are still want to punctuate this kind of, we acquired more work to make the 80s work conversation, 80s collection be more like a more solid. So we adding the no name group, we added some avant-garde group in Shanghai. So that's found like I found the 80s of the Chinese art is something even your intention want to talking about the connection between the 80s and the 90s, but in fact, the post-89 shows are so strong, and the people all focus on the at that time called the current art sense at that time. So in the whole 90s, totally 80s history be abandoned, been forgot, and then even until the 2005 or 2008, people start to rebuild that part. So that's quite an interesting phenomenon here. But my question to you is like, how do you feel that like a whole narrative from cynicalism, political, this kind of narrative, like the dimensions when we talk about the Chinese art, which came into being in the 90s, is that your intention?
What became the...
How do you feel that in the 90s, the cynical realism and the political pop become the only two, like a major sense, remain? And is that your intention?
Well,
how, as a founder, as a people, how do you feel that when you see this?
I don't think these two terms were actually very accurate description of the time.
Yeah.
When the exhibition was curated, and I invited Li Shenting to join, these were the two movements that he defined. In fact, he coined the terms. But I opened it up to more because I find that they are not the only defining features of the sensibility of the time. Yeah. So what I really wanted to show with that selection of 50 artists is the change in the sensibility of Chinese culture for the new generation, who were important makers and creators of artistic form. Yeah. So it was a very specific exhibition that I asked to look. So I actually visited not just the dozen artists involved in these two so-called political pop and cynical realism, but across the board of artists who were active in the mid-'80s. And I went to artists who actually had radical change in their art between 89 and 92, when the show was shown later on in 93. So it was a selection to indicate the transformation. It is not a show to give an encyclopedic view. And also, the two terms that you applied only apply to a part of the selection of the artists. And also, they're inaccurate. Later on, when the show happened in Hong Kong, I actually structured it mainly under aesthetic sensibilities, and not because cynical realism, political pop, they are terms about style, about styles inherited from the West. And in fact, the show is not about style. It's not about artistic style. It was about sensibilities. So in fact, both cynical realism and political pop have similar sensibility. And there are 6 sections. So I name all the other sections, but they were not stylistic, so they were less catchy in phrasing. So because this is a very focused exhibition, it sends a message to the audience, it sends a message to the audience about what China was like at that time. So in that sense, it became very successful. And I worked with these artists and many other artists since then.
I totally agree, and thank you for the clarification. Because when you build up the show, people are always easy to catch those things easy to understand, especially the style description. So people easy, and then more in-depth things people may need time to dig out. I also, there were many artists you work for a long time, like Wu Shanzhuan, Kwun, Xu Bin, also happened in that section of the post-89 show, and they are, in the long run, the history, they show more and more historical importance there. But that's also leads my question to Uli. When you really start to collect in the 90s as a foreigner in Beijing, there were no museums, there are not so many magazines, and as a brand new collector in this field, what is your resources? How do you build up a collection? How are those resources helped you to build up your judgment? Because you can see what the Johnson did post-89 show is quite complicated, something easy to catch, something more sophisticated. But how you navigate yourself at that time?
And my resources were very different because unlike Johnson, I did not have any knowledge of Chinese tradition and of Chinese culture when I came to China end of the 70s. So, but what I had was this experience from China, living, in China, for China, in that planned economy, in a communist country, and then being part of this whole transformation. And actually, what I didn't know at the time, the enterprise I created is actually the beginning of globalization in China. It's the first, joint venture with outside capital, outside technology. So I was there on the factory floor. I was there with the top management. I was there with the top Chinese leaders because the enterprise became a model. I could travel. The Chinese people couldn't travel at the time, except with a lot of bureaucracy. I could go anywhere. I had to go anywhere because they need elevators all over China, from Tibet to I don't know. So I could see more of China than most Chinese people could for long, and was involved, in the real transformation. So that was my resource. Plus, I had extensive knowledge of Western contemporary art, of the forefront of contemporary art in particular. And these were my two resources. Plus, of course, I met many people, and I had many, many debates with artists, with curators, etc. So these were my resources to form criteria. what I would want to acquire. And I did not just want to acquire masterpieces. I wanted to mirror the art production. That is more and different from, say, as most collectors would, just lining up a chain of pearls of masterpieces. It's more about also bringing in works that explain the context or explain subtexts to understand what the whole art movement, is living in and is formed by. So I had a very different approach, just trying to mirror, not according to my taste, but what I thought is important. And then I did some, you mentioned earlier, some exhibitions which forced me to do a lot of research into the tradition. Like I did a big Shanshui exhibition, I did a big calligraphy exhibition. So I had to deal with the issue, plus how contemporary artists view their own tradition. The work was actually, or the exhibitions were about that. So that gave me a lot of background, because I had to look at the real thing, and I had to look at what they make of it, and the different ways, and bring it into today's time, and ask my questions, which they themselves would not ask, actually. So, like in calligraphy, I did a project. I was looking for the answer, which characters are in your smart device? I couldn't find single Chinese had an idea. How many? Who defines them? Where do they come from, these decisions? And what does it mean for these characters that are not in your smart device, etc., etc.? So that's, say, was another way of digging into the tradition than, the knowledge Johnson Chang has.
Yeah, thank you. So Johnson, talking about the Johnson, Johnson is not only the founder and the owner of the Hanart, but he's also, in the meantime, very good collector. About 12 years ago, when I first landed Hong Kong as the Sigg creator for M+, at that time I happened to see Johnson's collection show. That's in the name of the 30 years anniversary of the Hanart, right? Which is a big collection show showing the Hong Kong Art Center, and the title is called 3 Words, and talking about the totally built up like a very comprehensive collection about the 20th century of Chinese art. And I found that it's very different from the structure of the post-89 show, which you participate in. So that should give you a lot of the inspiration when we do the Sigg collection show in M+. Do you want to share about your collection and your collection show, and how you want to map in that at that time? It's already 12 years ago, right?
Yes.
Almost, yeah.
And it was unbelievable. Well, then it comes to real collecting, because then you buy things, you acquire things, because you resonate, yeah, and you want to have it around, and like a lot of people, most people collect a lot of things. Once you own it, you have it in the back of your head, but you don't really look at them. But even just having the knowledge that is in your possession somewhere, there's this resonance, you have to react to this possession, and also a bit of liability, that there's something you need to look after. I think that aspect of collecting was what went beyond the projects I did. But in fact, as a gallery owner and works I do, I collected artworks, I collect artists, or periods of their work when I make exhibitions for them. So that is also, in a way, an act of collecting and selecting. But most of my work in terms of this acquisitive process of acquiring things, I always have another agenda, which is about reframing Chinese civilization in a way that I can assess them, and also the chance that how I chance upon opportunities to make a statement about them. So it is more like curating. How would one say? curating examples or what do you call these things you bring to a court, and you try to prove somebody's a criminal and you give them some evidence. So there are evidences really of these happenings that are in Chinese civilization which I want to restore or to promote. So the three parallel art exhibition is really a selection from the things I've acquired over my career. Many of them have nothing to do with fine art even. Some of them are just documents. And it is really almost all of it about witnessing Chinese modernity, but structured in a way that it answers, or at least summarized into different sections of aspects of Chinese modernity which art can bear witness up to. So there are witnesses and evidences of this journey of Chinese modernity.
So I just by now I found that there was a shared community between you two, because you are not only collectors, you are both the creators for your own collection. You did your collection of Three Words 12 years ago, and then obviously Uli also from the Mahjong show. And people always, when I was in the MM Plus, people always forget one fact, that Uli is my co-creator for the collection show. So you're really hands-on. But the difference is, it's like before 2012, you donated work to M Plus. You already did many shows, like a Mahjong show, Shan Shui show, which is the landscape, and then later calligraphy. So I also have the same question to you. When you start to make your collection show, how do you want to present that, and what's the way? What's the rationale to make this kind of the collection, and how that echo to your original intention of the collecting of Chinese art? Yeah.
I created exhibitions for an audience that is not at all familiar, neither with Chinese contemporary art nor with Chinese culture. So that shapes an exhibition very differently. You have to keep that in mind. And you have to create much more context about artworks and about the exhibition than you need to do in the Chinese cultural space. So that was a very important element. Like we mentioned the calligraphy show. How do you a show for an audience? I did the show in Hamburg for an audience who no one can read a single character. How do you bring that across in a way that will raise people's attention, keep an attention span? So it's very different from doing an exhibition here or in China. So my exhibitions had a different shape, therefore, and I always did extensive books. I did about 25 exhibitions. There are 25 books. What I just really, really regret is none of them ever entered China. Mm-hmm. You could never buy a book. So the Chinese public and even the Chinese professionals not really familiar with my collection. And many of them see it the first time here. Or many, many works they see for the first time. And this is an interesting issue, because you were talking also about we were talking about the canon being defined now, because we have now 45 years of contemporary art, which is a good phase to look back and say, well, this is really important, and this, what we thought is very important, maybe it's not. So it's the moment to write that canon, but I find that many professionals in China, because they didn't have an opportunity to see the works and the books, are not so familiar, but they don't know they are not so familiar with Chinese art production.
That's good. So let's talk about the other side. When we're talking about you are the historian defining collection, we are easy to talk this word now, but also I can expect that many people, or especially young creators, sometimes they also raise up the criticize to examine the ideas. Like who has the power to build the history, and if like it's the collector or it's the museum, and when the museum donated their collection to museum, they smoke their definition of the history to museum. I believe both of you faced many criticize to your collection, like maybe some very simplified criticize or without knowing the comprehensive collection. So how do you feel when you face this kind of the criticize to your collection? Like you are too personal. How do you balance that? Yeah, you first. And Uli also has big criticized for many years. Yeah.
I think the biggest problem in modern critical thinking is reduce everything to the issue of power. Because if we reduce things to the issue of power, then there's no need for intellectual discourse and no need for reflection. It is only what the result counts. And this is the problem of the contemporary political world as well. So I was never bothered by this because the field is wide open. But when one talks about history defining, you're actually already assuming a position or some viewpoint, some broader worldview that makes it possible to talk about history defining. Yeah, because that means what has been selected will become part of the lineage. And as a Chinaman, for me, the biggest pain and obsession all my life is about the lineage. So I'm interested in Confucius as much as I'm interested in Mao Zedong, and as much as I'm interested in what's happening now. But the big question is, how do you make sense of all these together if China continues to be China and is a coherent culture? So the three parallel art worlds is about finding a methodology to rethink what makes China still China today and what makes China a civilization in the world. Even though it is now a century since they actively tried to transform itself to become a Western civilization. So this is, I think, the issue we need to think about. So I suppose the question about history defining is really more about what is in the back of Uli's mind and my mind. What is this history that one refers to make the world? Now, we always assume that the linear chronology we have about art history that you see in museums, because there's always a kind of a chronological development, and then also there are multiple developments, and then there are also cross-sections. These are considered to be mappings of at least cultural history. However, as a lot of museum directors all know today, and also they have pressure to resituate this in whether it's multicultural or whether it's multi-civilizational or whether it's a crossover between science, art, civilizations, and artistic production. All this actually also comes down to something more coherent and unified. If it is a personal thing, yeah. And so for me, the groping for a more overarching concept which I can map all these things in my head and pursue what I was doing, of course, standing on the debris of historical Chinese civilization, I need to rethink how it has to reposition itself in the world today. And for me, the strategy, I think, is to, well, the approach usually is through history of thought. And history of thought, mainly philosophical thought that directs politics and culture and all that. But I've been always very curious about the positioning of Chinese civilization in how the how the body is being trained as a social body, political body, and a cosmic body.
Yeah.
And that is actually something you find in traditional Chinese medicine. So there's one thing that affects my thinking. Now, when you talk about collecting, because the next word is collection. In China, the word for collecting is Chang, is Chang, so Chang. So is just bringing in Chang, is to preserve and conserve. But the thing is, this word, in the archaic etymology of the word, is the same words used for in the Yellow Emperor Tract of Chinese medicine. It's the same word used to describe the 5 important organs that serves processing and keeping of the material they intake into the body. And what does the 5 conserving organs do? They digest, they absorb. And the most important thing is that they transform. And what is being transformed is transformed into the vital energy that serves the rest of the body. And the most important things are the concerted effort of these into something beyond animal survival requirement, but also into the spirit. Okay. And it is a medical theory which has a position for the soul. So, this, I think, is a framework for collecting, which one needs to think about.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very beautiful metaphor. Talking about the cultural metaphor, medical metaphor, about what's the collecting mean, and it can generate more energy for the future development. So we can talk about that. It's very interesting when you talk about this culture and energies there. But before that, I want to throw the question to Uli that we work together for many years. I think usually where we mutually criticize, okay, your collection represents the foreign perspective, and you have to make your selection by your donate work to M+, and you put your personal perspective understanding on top of the public interest, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, that's always we have to face these kind of things. How do you feel that? I mean, that's like I think you face this kind of criticism both outside of China and inside of China for many years as a foreign collector who built up the historical collection of Chinese art, right?
I wouldn't call it blah, blah, blah. I of course, must fully understand, that there is criticism. Why should this, weird foreigner decide on what's meaningful and what's not meaningful Chinese contemporary art? I fully understand that question. And, when I started the Chinese Contemporary Art Award, people would actually ask exactly that question. Why should this person decide? Of course, I didn't decide. It was a jury with international, with Chinese curators, museum directors who took decisions. And it's somewhat similar with my collection. I see it more as an offering. It's offering to the Chinese people, look at their own art, take their decisions. But I would like them to do informed decisions. So I can live quite well with this criticism, which then, was ever more subdued. And how should I put this? It's more a kind of universe which is incomplete, which can be completed by M+. That's there as an offering to take exactly those decisions, formulate the canon, see what lasts, see what may not last. So I can live with this. And of course, as a foreigner, you rightly have to identify your blind spot. If we look into another culture, of course, we have a blind spot. That blind spot may have different size, dimension. And so, we heard Chang, how he views like these connections to the body, Chinese philosophies. Well, I come from a very different point of view. I have to be aware, where's my blind spot? How do I overcome it in my selection? So for me, it was always a very conscious process, and very important to go through this process with my daily experience, as I was describing it in the beginning. So I think that gives me one set of competencies, which may be very different one from people who come out of the Chinese tradition, but also based on Chinese reality.
Yeah. Thank you. And I also believe that what makes history, recording history possible is because we have both the perspectives, and that's why the function of the museum, we are not only collect the work, but we also collect the perspectives. And then with collecting all of them, we can build up new narratives of that. We have a little bit of time here. Before I open the question to the floor, I have one question. We talk about the collecting, we talk about the collection, we talk about the contemporary art. Then we should talk about the Chinese. Like, we are now, at my institution, I'm working for Daiguan Contemporary. We are now planning another like a kind of historical survey show of Chinese art after 2008. The show will open in 2026, kind of like homage to Johnson's show, post-89 show, homage to Ma Jiang show. I think at the turning point of the first quarter of the 21st century is now time also to offer another historical perspective to understand what's happened in China now. So then we face the question, even for the many younger generation, the artists, what we just about the coherent as China as a coherent the culture. But for many people, maybe it's also the question now if these Chinese are still exist. We have so many creators, second generation Chinese, so many Chinese people they get to the boarding school in UK and go to the art college in America, shifting to another place. So that's, for my understanding, the period is very different from that in the past time. What we are trying to do, we want to launch a lot of research. We collaborate with the AAA as a research institution. We are more defined China as as one of the destination of the globalization. So we more trying to do the Chinese show, we more talk about it's not a contemporary art of Chinese. It's more like a contemporary art in China, or how people dealing with China as Chineseness as the subject. That's what we are trying to do. But I also want to listen from you two, your judgment for the current generation. How you weight, how you still weight the Chinese in your collection, because like totally after 30 years of the globalization in China, it's totally different young generation, different attitude to this so-called Chinese. So that's the question for you two, the last question.
Are you looking at me, Pili?
You first, then Johnson.
Yeah. Well, the China of today, if we talk about like the big cities, main parts of like Chinese geography, and where the collectors mainly come from, is ever more a hybrid from the culture Chang has been describing, and like Western culture, and predominantly U.S. culture. One may like that or not. And so that very much shapes the new young Chinese, this generation you were just talking about. So, of course, they make very different choices. And they have different views of what Chineseness is, if they even want to have a view on this. Yeah. And just an interesting anecdote, when I did the Ma Jiang exhibition, I wrote to, I think it was over 80 artists, I wrote a letter to everyone and asked them, is there something like Chineseness? If yes, what is it? Do you purposely use it in your work? Do you purposely refuse it in your work? Or you simply don't care? And it was very interesting what came back, and we talk about 2004, which is 20 years ago, a different generation at that time. And many of them thought, well, what an odd question this is, because I'm a Chinese. What I do is Chineseness, is Chinese contemporary art, even if it may not be like that. And other responded, is there Swissness, in Swiss art, and do you purposely refuse Swissness, etc. So the question seemed to be too early for most, and it would be very interesting, to hear the answers now of this from this generation you talk about. I'm not so certain what they will say.
Johnson.
Well, in today's world, I think. We all think that everything is homogeneous and flat. We can be European, we can be African, we can be Asian, but practically it's not true. People live mainly in certain places, and they also come with deeper attachment to cultural practices where they live. So a Chinese person brought up in America or Canada. Of course, they will have a different memory of their experiences. But then because of their ethnicity, they may also have this inclination to want to learn more, and they want to increase the knowledge about China. So the richness and diversities of cultures in the world will continue to be the one thing that would defend us against this universalization of the digital technology and the greater memory that is being created and controlled by few media companies. And for today's art practices, and basically most of my work, apart from trying to sell art, is as a curator. And I'm not been that successful in selling art. So I often have to sell my collection to pay for my my business. But the important thing really is how do you make the best of resources from your from the culture that you have the deepest memory of, or whether you can retrieve this memory for new knowledge, for new inspiration, and also for new energy to have new start, because otherwise. The great flatness of culture in the world is not in these cultural influences between cultures of the world, but in the technological flattening of things into data. And we can actually still do a lot around it without falling into this trap. So my work has not always been just about visual art, which can be traded as commodity. I think it's now very important to seek out resources which will give more defining recognition of where every person is, and also how to make that resource workable or contribute, mainly how to contribute to the world in general.
Great, thank you. That's a very fruitful answer. And yeah, I won't occupy the floor for so long. I should open the floor for questions. I think we can have 3 questions. And wow, okay. Okay, the black lady, yeah, you.
Thank you so much.
If they answer question fast, maybe you can have 5 questions.
Okay, cool.
So let's see.
Thank you so much for the amazing panel talk. So I actually had 2 questions. The first one is, what's the focus of your current or future collections? Are you still looking for works to add up to your comprehensive collections, or you are looking at different, or you shift your focus? So that's my first question. And the second one is, do you see anything you like in Art Basel? And what kind of work is that? Thank you.
I think we can skip the second question for the company of interest, just for the first question for both you two. Well, how you extend your collection? Yeah.
Yes. If collecting is the raw material for your digestive organs, then you have to keep getting nutrition and transforming it into real energy and nutrition. So it has to keep going. But of course, the real issue that comes with that is that do you recycle the refuse efficiently?
Okay. Uli? What? Continue. Still collecting.
Well, there's no need for me to continue to collect as I did. When I did the donation, it still made sense to build an encyclopedic collection, but now there are many institutions in China, there are many collectors in China, so, they all will take over. And that means I can return more to my very personal taste, collect what I like, where people start to collect. But I like to commission works. So I'm actually a researcher of China, Chinese society, economy, politics. So if a new issue surfaces, I will go out and try to find an artist, who could be the artist to jointly with me. I may get involved in the creative process if the artist likes. And that's the kind of work I do now, rather than buy a finished product, even though we see some interesting finished products in the fair.
Okay, thank you. Maybe the lady in red on the first front first. Yeah.
Thank you. And my question for Uli, when you introduce your collection to Chinese and foreigners, did you have different interpretations of opinions? Thank you.
Quite different opinions. What has been very interesting and moving for me is say going through the first and the second exhibition in M+, particularly with people from the mainland, and many of them were crying. They were very moved. I haven't seen a Western person yet crying from Chinese contemporary. I mean, they're very interested, but they cannot associate it with their own lives, with their own experience, and they don't have this surprise that many Chinese people have. They have no idea that there is such a width and depth of Chinese art creation.
Okay. I want to open the question to that lady, black and white. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Johnson Chan.
Yeah.
Hi. I've been recording all the time. I'm sorry. I possibly would interrupting you a little bit. My question is, and as an art advisor, I would like to know what the galleries you are looking for, the artists. Is there like a gender preference or the age or like the career previously? For example, like about 40, male, like has been establishing a formed style? Yes, because I got friends. I'm thinking it's a possibly good idea to recommend a little bit. Thank you.
Well, with my gallery, of course I have my own agenda, like most galleries, and my own preference. But for me, being in the art field is there is some cultural responsibility, and my interest is to promote sections of culture that requires reinterpreting, requires promoting and enlarging. One of my main in the last 2-3 years, there are one field that I've been focusing on is art of the written word. Art of the written word in China, and also slowly the interaction with other cultures. And then the other interest I've been working on for over a decade is the art of a landscape, mountain water art. So these are my main interests. Then I also have an interest in identifying fresh turns in the cultural world. And for that, I've been looking at artworks made by collectives. Yes.
Preference for like a man who's 45 years old and focusing on the portrait of a lady, but combining with like Zhao Wuji's like abstract and also a landscape like a traditional Chinese ink painting, which is really unique at what I see currently. Thank you.
I see every artwork or artist I work with as a project, and of course I prefer dead artists because they don't speak back to you. And I also work with artists who I see as a possibility to further my interest in, say, defining questions which I've not really found answers to, like how do you preserve the legacy of an artist who has passed away, or how do you position artwork which I sense is part of a greater movement, whether locally or globally. And so I would select artist projects, firstly based on what I feel is the merit of the art as artwork, and how they would actually also answer to this private agenda of professional interest about the idea of institution, the idea of memory of culture, an idea of cultural struggles in the world, and also about promoting lost memories.
Okay, thank you. I think one last question, the lady in white. Yeah. Yes. I think we can. Let's see. I try to have more questions. A comment.
Hi, I'm Mimi. I actually just joined the Sigg team, and we had a meeting last week, and I was dying to ask you this question, but I didn't get a chance to. It's for Uli Sigg, and I was wondering, how do you discern the significance of artworks in real time, considering the historical context often becomes clear in hindsight? And I also have another question too, last one, I promise. How do you see your art contributing to cross-cultural understanding and dialogue, particularly in today's interconnected world?
Okay, thank you. Very good question.
It's actually, in fact, a lot of questions. I think art is, of course, a very good vehicle for this intercultural understanding. Not that it will really change the world, but it will prepare people to understand that there are many different ways to look at one thing. And I think that's the main purpose. Now, what I collect, I understand, or when I think a work is of historical significance or not, well, that's a thing of the past, as I said, when I was trying to create the encyclopedic collection. Then it was about mirroring whatever is of concern to the Chinese artist. I focused on the artist living in China, in mainland, because I was so interested in the art that comes out of this very fierce transition and this wild energy of the mainland over time. Not that, diaspora artists wouldn't do very good works, but my means also, unfortunately, are finite, so I have to have a concentration. Now, just very short, what am I looking now? When I look for my own taste, then what I really look for, the artist has to take me somewhere I cannot go on my own. That's what I'm looking for.
Thank you. That's a very good quote. As the ending of this conversation, make us similar. The collections the artists bring we to some place we cannot go alone. Thank you, and enjoy the fair in the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you for two speakers. Very thoughtful, fruitful conversation. Thank you.